What is our Dharma? What is our quest? What do I mean by Dharma Knights? Let me start by asking a different question. What does everybody out there on the internet, social media, etc., mean when they refer to themselves as a spiritual warrior? I'm honestly very perplexed by this. I think what the implication is that they feel like their spiritual journey has hardship and maybe inner conflict that they overcome, or maybe it's just a popular hashtag and people maybe just kind of say it without really thinking too deeply about it. I don't know. Maybe people just like it because it sounds cool. But for me, spiritual warrior is something that actually has some connotations to it that matter. And historically, that's the case too. So what's one of the big things that matters to me when I hear that word? When we talk about yoga, and even if we take another step back and talk about comparative religion or Hinduism specifically, or, the environment from which yoga came from, one of the most important books is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita is just one part of a larger story called the Mahabharata. But the Bhagavad Gita is generally portable as its own self-contained book, even though it's just one chapter, one exploded episode out of this whole greater story about a huge civil war between one clan called the Kuru clan. And on one side, there's the Pandavas, which is 5 brothers who are very bonded to one another and have semi-divine origins, and they have like high supplies of virtue, even though they have their own little personal flaws. And on the other side is their cousins, the Kauravas, who are 100 sons of the blind king Dhritarashtra, and none of them are particularly virtuous. They would be passable by today's political standards, I guess, as competent leaders, at least in the sense that they reward their friends, they punish their enemies, and the people love them. But there's always the question of which people love them and what happens to the people that don't love them, right? So you have the Pandavas, who are dedicated to virtue and live half of their life in spiritual exile with a bunch of yogis in the forest, both during their childhood and later during their adulthood. And on the other hand, you have their cousins, the Kauravas, who have spent their whole life in the palace with all the privileges implied. They're very insecure about the possibility that their cousins, the Pandavas, will somehow get the kingdom. And there's a huge convoluted series of events, which I might talk about in another podcast. But the short version is the Pandavas get ripped off and ripped off bad. And they get not only their own kingdom sort of illegitimately stolen from them by their cousins, the Kauravas, but also there's really kind of a hanging question of whether or not the kingdom that the Kauravas rule, Hastinapura, whether or not they should be ruling that kingdom either, because in the eyes of all the virtuous people of that kingdom, they're kind of like bad people, right? They're not good rulers, or they're at least not dedicated to virtue. And in some cases, they let ethically disastrous things happen. And one very famous episode of the story that sort of sets most of these things in motion is when they host a rigged gambling match, which, like, between kings, it was kind of a thing where, we'll have a friendly gambling match and we're both honor bound to do these sorts of things from time to time. But in this particular story, it gets taken way too far, where the Kauravas basically cheat at dice every single roll, and they win illegitimately. They win the kingdom from the Pandavas, and they even win their freedom as individuals. Like they get slavery as one of the stakes. And so they lose their own freedom. They lose their wife. It's a huge disaster. And along the way, their wife, Draupadi, gets terribly abused, like just humiliated. They try to undress her in front of the court, and she's only miraculously kept with garments around her by Krishna, who's an avatar of Vishnu. And this all gets very complicated, but the point is there's this gigantic civil war, which is about to rip open the kingdom. And on the eve of the first battle, the Prince Arjuna, who's waited his whole life and trained his whole life to be the best archer and like a warrior among princes, like a preeminent warrior. Suddenly he loses heart because he realizes, oh shit, I'm going to have to kill members of my own family. Whether or not he personally has a lot of affection for his cousins is another story, but he also has his beloved granduncle and his own martial arts guru and his own childhood spiritual guru on the other side. And he's going to have to slaughter all these people if their side of the civil war is to come out victorious. And lest anyone think that this is just like a simple property dispute, Krishna, who's the avatar of Vishnu, the preserver god, basically shows up to advise Arjuna not to lose heart, not to lose sight of his focus. And he basically leads him through this wonderful dialogue, which is the entirety of the Bhagavad Gita. And it's spiritual instruction. It's also part motivational speech. And it's also a treatise on 4 distinct types of yoga. Karma yoga, the yoga of action. Jnana yoga, the yoga of intellect. Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And there's also sort of the beginnings of the implication of a yoga that binds them all together called Raja Yoga, which is sort of a systematic practice that Patanjali later expounds upon in the Yoga Sutras. But one of the huge thrusts of all this writing, and why I'm taking the time to describe it, is there's a message that there's a yoga that's appropriate for those who still want to be involved in the world. And in this time and place, especially coming out of the influence of Buddhism, where suddenly there was a bunch of monastic orders breaking away from the main religious folds of the day, leaving society to go have like private religious experiences or enlightenment experiences, like in the way of monks. But meanwhile, all these other people still enmeshed in the world, like the quote-unquote householders, and this could be like small nuclear family householders. This could be the heads of royal families. It could be anything in between. But basically people who still have relationships in the world, still have duties they have to perform, and don't they get to have a spiritual experience too? What does yoga look like for them? And what does yoga even mean when we get down to talking about it? So that's all some context. And the idea is extremely on the nose here that Arjuna is meant to be a quote-unquote spiritual warrior. He receives spiritual instruction, but he's also a warrior. He has duties to perform in order to uphold the Dharma of the world. And the Dharma of the world is sort of like, it's a complicated concept for Westerners, but it's somewhere in the cross-section of the ethical framework of the world that binds everyone together, while also having a component wherein individuals have to kind of suss out their own role in this overall ethical framework. Like, what is their duty? What's their purpose? What's the right thing for them to do? What's the right thing for the whole society to do? And how is it going to be kind of relativistically different for each individual? So it's not like a 10 commandments kind of thing where it's like, okay, well, here's 10 rules. Just don't break those 10 rules, and that's your covenant. It's not like that at all. There's kind of a sophisticated calculus that individuals have to be able to do, and it can be a lifelong journey where they figure out what exactly their dharma is. What's my duty? What's my purpose? What is the ethically right thing for me to do? What's the right action for me to take? And how can I be personally detached from my own desires in reaching for these correct actions? When you put all those things together, that's what all the fuss is about. And the metaphor that they chose, like the episode of this whole greater story of the Mahabharata that they chose to magnify, to make these points, is specifically a battlefield metaphor. And the character that they're running through the paces here is the preeminent warrior. He's an actual warrior. There's no ambiguity as far as like how is this person a warrior and how is he spiritual? He actually has like warrior duties that he has to uphold, that he's trained his whole life to do. He has to go to literal battles. And along the way, he has to make sure he's doing it for the righteous reasons. And he's not always personally clear on that. So he has to have the supreme God of the universe give him this magnificent speech and instruction while he stops time all around to do it. And it eventually culminates in Krishna showing Arjuna his universal form at Arjuna's request. And when this happens in the Greek stories, like let's say, for example, one of Zeus's human playthings, who he has an amorous affair with, she'll say, "Oh, Zeus, please show me your true form." And he'll say, "That's a bad idea." And she'll insist. And when he does, they'll burst into flames, right? They'll be incinerated right away. This is a different concept here. Arjuna is actually capable of seeing this universal form, and he's awed by it, and it's an overwhelming experience, but he can experience it. And part of the accent difference here is, in this whole framework of thinking, spiritual aspirants have some capability of comprehending the infinite and the divine. We are somewhere on that path capable. So most of us in our day-to-day lives right now, unless we're in the military or in law enforcement, we don't necessarily get in a lot of dust-ups. We don't really get in a lot of fistfights. We don't really get in a lot of mortal combat situations if we don't have any of those particular vocations. And yet our life is still filled with conflict. And part of what I'm driving home here is, in my own personal environments where I situate myself in a yoga community, just as one example, anytime things would get politically heated, most of the interaction that I would see on these sorts of topics, I'd see a lot of yogis basically like just checking out and saying, well, no, none of this has anything to do with yoga. Like, whatever tangles the world gets in, that has nothing to do with my own path towards peace or whatever. But this whole book, the Bhagavad Gita, says the exact opposite. It says, yeah, that sounds nice. You could go meditate under a tree and renounce everything, but you have some obligations. You have duties, and you can't just discard that because you find it personally distasteful. So a spiritual warrior is someone who has this task to expand their spiritual substance and expand their mind and expand their capability for transcendent experiences, but they also have worldly duties, worldly responsibilities, and worldly conflicts where they have to make choices, and they can't necessarily be fence riders. So is it possible to take this idea in a very dangerous direction? Yes. And one colorful example, Nazi elites, many of them used to carry copies of the Bhagavad Gita. They were obsessed with the Aryan historical narrative, and they tried to align themselves with that Aryan, in this case, meaning like the Indo-European invaders or migration, however you want to look at it, going through the Caucasus Mountains and the Khyber Pass and going into the Indian subcontinent, writing the Vedas and all this kind of thing. They saw all of that as like part of the same route of one super people just slowly conquering the world through the Asian subcontinent and then Europe in different directions. And they were trying to align themselves with that from like the standpoint of being inheritors of conquest. So they used that as ammunition for fascist bullshit. And that's not where we want to go with this. Like, you can use all this stuff to justify terrible things. Just like in World War II, a lot of the Imperial Japanese would leverage Buddhist, like specifically Zen Buddhist spiritual teachings, to give their soldiers the spiritual technology to basically spiritually bypass moral problems that they would have with killing other human beings. They'd be like, oh, well, it's actually the sword is moving and you happen to be moving the sword as it strikes. And they would basically like atomize it into a discontinuous thing that relieved the person of any personal responsibility, cloaking it in the language of transcendence. So being a spiritual warrior can be used in some pretty ghastly directions. But the whole point of the Bhagavad Gita is to say, hey, look, there's all these warriors on the other side who, out of personal honor or whatever else, allowed themselves to be chained to the wrong side of the battlefield, like people doing terrible things. But we want to be on the side which aligns itself with Dharma, that doesn't do terrible things. And if we do have to do terrible things, it's going to be to uphold the greater Dharma, not for our own personal glory, not for our own illegitimate political power, but for the sum total of everything that's good and right in the universe, and how that manifests in what we're supposed to do on Earth to help that be reflected. So you put all these ideas together, and this is what comes to mind for me when we talk about spiritual warriors. So what does that mean to us who don't have military, police jobs, all these sorts of things? We are nonetheless all situated in some sort of role in the machinery of the world. We all end up, like, all the things we buy, the things we support, the messages and stories that we help spread, somehow or another we contribute. And what we contribute to has the capability to be like a conscious experience. There's a certain amount of resignation that I think is easy to fall into, and some of it in terms of daily survival is necessary. Like, I don't necessarily love eating meat that's the product of cruelty and all these other sorts of things. I try my best to not necessarily do that right now. For example, I try to get like organic fish, if anything, and that's just one example. But I also try to have some sort of political consciousness, and not politics in the sense of this game that doesn't actually have any real world consequences, and it's more about like a personal identity thing. No, it's actually the exact opposite for me. I try to align myself with causes in one way or another, at one level of contribution or another, that I think is actually aligned with Dharma, not just something that's a cheap identity signaling. And that's just one example. I mean, we don't even necessarily have to take politics, but if we're going to go around calling ourselves spiritual warriors, I think we need to actually take that seriously. And I think that means taking at least two separate things very seriously. What does it mean to be spiritual? And then what does it mean to be a warrior? And then recombining those things. Like, yoga is about union. Yoga is about combining things that are separate, right? Like the Sanskrit word vyuj that we get yoga from, meant to like yoke a chariot to a horse. That's very much making them move as one unified thing rather than two separate things. So if we are going to vyuj, if we're going to engage in yoga by combining spiritual pursuits and explorations of what it means to personally be a quote-unquote warrior, we have to take both of those things seriously on their own, and then we have to take the combination of those things seriously. And to me, that's a lifelong project. And it doesn't just begin and end with reading the Bhagavad Gita and saying, oh, how lovely, or how intellectually stimulating. But along the way, it does make me very interested in looking at the stories throughout history and world literature, both from like mythological story standpoint, epic writing, in the way that epics capture kind of the values of cultures, and looking for the spiritual content therein. It makes me very interested in seeing what samurais who were invested in Zen Buddhism had to say, on and on and on and on. So I'm very interested in kind of exploring what warriors had to say, what spiritual people had to say, and what spiritual warriors had to say. And I'm even more interested in how I actually integrate that into my own life in a meaningful way, where I'm not just living in the past out of intellectual curiosity or fantasizing about some hypothetical future, but how I'm actually aligning myself with these ideas and these curiosities in a way that speaks to my present day life. So how do I make myself strong the way a warrior needs to make themselves strong? And more importantly, for what reason? And what are the conflicts that I'm enmeshed in? And maybe even a greater sense, I can say, what is my quest, right? So if a spiritual warrior has quests, which they very often, I almost want to say always do. Well, what is my quest? If I'm a spiritual warrior, that implies that I have a quest. And am I clear about what that quest is? And if I'm clear about what that quest is, am I also clear about how that quest sits in the overall Dharma? My personal Dharma, the universal Dharma around me, like what's the big picture and how do I fit into that big picture? So I'll be talking to people that also have an interest in these topics. I'll be talking about books that I've read before or new books that I'm reading. I want to use this podcast to explore these ideas. And along the way, I also plan on offering some pragmatic stuff. So there's the intellectual curiosity component of this, there's the spiritual seeking component, but there's also anyone who's just tuning into this for some form of infotainment that can hopefully get some kind of nugget for day-to-day life that they can actually operationalize for their own quests in some useful way, even better. So I hope you guys can hang with me on this, and I'll try to keep a pretty consistent schedule in terms of the material that I crank out, and I already have an idea of a few people that I want to invite. But let's keep the conversation going, and let's find out what it means to be spiritual warriors in today's world, and maybe along the way find out what it meant to be spiritual warriors for other people in the worlds of yesterday. Somewhere in between, maybe we learn a little bit more about what our future might look like.